Sometimes the most profound connections happen when we least expect them. At 67, Jed McCaffrey thought his days of making a real difference were truly over. His wife was gone, most of his ranch sold, and he was just going through the motions. Then one spring day at a livestock auction, he saw 4 terrified wolf pups crammed into a cage, destined for exotic pet buyers. Something about their frightened eyes awakened a purpose he thought he'd lost forever. Against all logic and law, Jed bought those pups and raised them secretly in the remote hills behind his own property. But what happens when those wolves grow up and Jed finds himself lost and injured in a winter storm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing Jed McCaffrey noticed each morning wasn't the mountain sunrise, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink, or the familiar creak of the old barn settling in the cool air. It was the absence of Martha's humming from the kitchen below. 3 years had passed since the cancer took her, and still he reached across the empty bed each dawn, his weathered hand finding only cold sheets where her warmth used to be. At 67, Jed moved through his reduced world with the careful precision of a man who understood that every day was borrowed time. The ranch that had once sprawled across 800 acres now consisted of just the original homestead, a modest 2-story house, the red barn his grandfather had built in 1923, and 40 acres of pasture that rolled toward the foothills of the Beartooth Mountains. He'd sold the rest piece by piece after Martha's funeral, keeping only what one man could reasonably manage alone. The house felt enormous now. Rooms that had once buzzed with the energy of family gatherings, now standing silent as monuments to memory. Martha's presence lingered everywhere, in the quilt draped over the living room sofa, in the mason jars of preserves still lined up in the pantry, in the garden she'd tended with such devotion that even now untended, wild roses and daylilies pushed through the weeds in stubborn defiance of neglect. Jed twisted the thin gold band on his ring finger, a habit that had developed in the months after Martha's passing. The wedding ring had grown loose on his finger as age and grief had whittled away at him, but he couldn't bring himself to resize it. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed against his chest like a physical weight, he would slip the ring off and hold it up to the light, remembering the day he'd placed it on Martha's finger 43 years ago in the little church in town. She'd been 24 then, a school teacher with auburn hair and eyes the color of sage honey. He'd been a young rancher with more ambition than sense, convinced he could build an empire from the raw Montana wilderness. They'd made a good team, Martha tempering his impulsiveness with her steady wisdom, Jed providing the drive and determination that turned their modest spread into one of the most successful operations in the valley. But that was before arthritis settled into his joints like an unwelcome tenant, before his back began to protest the simple act of saddling a horse, before the math of running a large ranch became impossible for one aging man to sustain. The buyers had been respectful when they came for the cattle, the equipment, the prime grazing land. They understood they were purchasing pieces of a lifetime's work, and they treated the transactions with appropriate gravity. Now Jed's days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Morning coffee on the front porch, watching the sun climb above the peaks. A walk around the remaining property, checking fences that rarely needed repair, and feeding the 3 horses he'd kept. 2 aging mares named Belle and Daisy, and a gentle gelding called Buck, who'd been Martha's favorite. Lunch was usually something simple from a can, eaten standing at the kitchen counter while looking out at the garden Martha had loved. The afternoons stretched longest. Sometimes he drove the old Ford pickup into town for supplies, stopping at Miller's feed store where the old-timers gathered to discuss weather and politics and the general decline of everything. The conversations were comfortable in their familiarity, but Jed often found himself on the periphery, nodding at appropriate intervals while his mind wandered to tasks that needed doing back home. Evenings brought television programs he watched without really seeing, books he read but struggled to remember, and the gradual settling of a house that seemed to sigh in the gathering darkness. The silence that had once been companionable when shared with Martha now felt oppressive, broken only by the settling of old wood and the distant call of coyotes in the hills. It was Doc Harrison who first suggested that Jed might benefit from getting out more, maybe finding some kind of purpose beyond maintaining a property that was really too much for one person. The suggestion came during a routine checkup in town, delivered with the careful diplomacy of a man who'd been treating the same families for 3 decades. "You know, Jed," Doc had said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the chart, "loneliness isn't just an emotional burden. It affects physical health too. Blood pressure, immune system, cognitive function. The human animal isn't designed for isolation." Jed had nodded politely and promised to consider the doctor's advice, but the truth was, he felt safer in his isolation. Out there in the world, he was confronted constantly with reminders of what he'd lost. Couples walking hand in hand, families gathered for meals, the casual intimacy of people who hadn't yet learned how quickly it could all disappear. The neighbors tried their best. Sarah Chen, who owned the property to the east, brought casseroles with mechanical regularity, always with the gentle insistence that he shouldn't be eating alone every night. Tom Bradley, whose ranch bordered his to the south, occasionally stopped by with offers to help with repairs or maintenance, though they both knew Jed was perfectly capable of handling such tasks himself. These gestures of kindness touched something deep in Jed's chest. But they also highlighted his growing detachment from the community that had once been central to his life. At church socials and town meetings, at the annual county fair and Christmas pageants, he felt like a ghost haunting the margins of celebrations he no longer knew how to join. It was this restlessness, this sense of being unmoored from his own life, that led him to break his routine on a particular Thursday in late April. The livestock auction in Billings was announcing the liquidation of an exotic animal farm, and something about the advertisement in the newspaper caught his attention. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, or perhaps it was the need to be somewhere other than the too quiet house and the too familiar pastures. The decision to attend the auction felt spontaneous. But as Jed loaded a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches into the pickup truck, he realized it was the first time in months that he'd felt genuine anticipation about anything. The drive to Billings would take most of the morning, winding through country he knew well but rarely traveled anymore. As he backed the truck out of the driveway, Jed caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror, grey hair that needed cutting, eyes that had grown deeper set with age and sorrow. The weathered face of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. Martha used to say he was handsome in a Gary Cooper sort of way, all quiet strength and understated dignity. Looking at himself now, he saw mainly the accumulated weight of too many solitary days. The road stretched ahead through country that had shaped him, past ranches where he'd helped with brandings and barn raisings, through small towns where he'd bought supplies and shared coffee with men who understood the rhythm of rural life. The familiar landscape awakened something in him that had been dormant too long, a sense of connection to something larger than his own grief. By the time he reached the outskirts of Billings, Jed felt more alert than he had in months. The auction facility buzzed with the energy of serious buyers and curious onlookers, the air thick with dust and the mingled scents of hay and livestock. He parked the truck and walked toward the corrals, his boots crunching on gravel that reminded him of county fairs from his youth. He had no intention of buying anything. He was simply a man filling a day with something other than solitude, seeking the comfort of voices and movement and purpose. But as he would soon discover, the best intentions often crumble in the face of unexpected compassion, and sometimes the most important decisions of our lives disguise themselves as simple impulses toward kindness. The auction yard hummed with the familiar chaos of commerce and livestock. Jed moved through the crowd with the easy gait of a man who'd attended such events for decades, nodding to acquaintances and taking measure of the animals on display. The morning air carried the scent of dust and manure, coffee from vendor stands, and the underlying tension that always accompanied serious money-changing hands. Most of the lots were standard fare: cattle, horses, farm equipment worn smooth by honest work. Jed found himself gravitating toward the horse corrals, admiring a young quarter-horse mare with intelligent eyes and good conformation. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine leading her back to his place, giving Buck and the mares some company. But the practical voice in his head, the one that sounded increasingly like Martha, reminded him that 3 horses were already more than he needed. It was the commotion near the back fence that drew his attention away from the horses. A small crowd had gathered around a series of makeshift cages, their voices carrying a mix of curiosity and unease. Jed approached slowly, his boots careful on the uneven ground, and what he saw stopped him cold. 4 wolf cubs, barely old enough to be weaned, huddled together in a cage designed for chickens. They were grey and black, with the oversized paws and ears that marked them as wild rather than domestic, their yellow eyes wide with terror as strangers pressed close to examine them. The largest of the 4, a male with distinctive white markings on his chest, stood protectively in front of his siblings. Tiny lips pulled back in a futile snarl. "Exotic pet markets booming," said a voice behind Jed. He turned to see Randy Morrison, a livestock dealer he'd known for years, shaking his head with obvious distaste. Fellow up in Canada was breeding them illegally. Fish and Wildlife seized the whole operation. And now they're liquidating everything through private sale. Jed's stomach tightened as he watched a well-dressed couple examining the cubs with the casual interest of people shopping for lawn furniture. The woman pointed at the smallest cub, a female with 1 torn ear, and made some comment about how cute she would be in their backyard habitat. "They're selling them as pets?" Jed asked, though he already knew the answer. "Technically, they're selling them to licensed exotic animal facilities," Randy replied, his tone suggesting he knew exactly how flimsy that distinction was. "But you and I both know where most of these babies will end up. Rich folks in California and Texas who think a wolf in the backyard makes them special." The auction moved efficiently through the regular livestock, but Jed found his attention drifting repeatedly to the cubs. They had stopped trying to snarl at the gawking spectators and now simply pressed together in the center of their inadequate cage, trembling with exhaustion and fear. Something about their resignation struck him as profoundly wrong, a violation of the wild dignity these creatures were born to embody. When the auctioneer finally called for bids on Lot 47, 4 North American gray wolf cubs, age approximately 8 weeks, Jed felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately name. The bidding started at $500 and climbed steadily as several buyers competed with the detached efficiency of people purchasing commodities. At $800, most of the crowd dropped out, leaving 3 serious bidders: the well-dressed couple from California, a man in expensive boots who kept consulting his phone, and a woman who introduced herself as representing a roadside zoo in Oklahoma. None of them looked at the cubs as they bid. Their eyes stayed fixed on the auctioneer as the price climbed toward 4 figures. Jed had attended enough auctions to recognize the rhythm, the way serious buyers revealed themselves through subtle signals and careful timing. These people had money and experience, and they would push the bidding as high as necessary to secure their purchase. The cubs were simply another acquisition, no different from a piece of farm equipment or a breeding bull. $1,100, called the man with the expensive boots. The woman from Oklahoma hesitated, clearly reaching her limit. The California couple exchanged a quick conversation before the man raised his hand. $1,150. That's when something shifted inside Jed, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Martha's illness, the absolute conviction that he had to act, regardless of logic or consequence. He thought of the cubs' eyes, the way they had stared out at the crowd with an intelligence too profound for creatures barely 2 months old. He thought of the roadside zoo in Oklahoma, the backyard habitat in California, The lifetime of captivity stretching ahead of these wild things. His hand rose before his mind had fully processed the decision. $1,200. The words left his mouth with surprising firmness, carrying across the auction yard with the authority of a man who had spent decades making quick decisions about livestock and land. Heads turned in his direction, including the auctioneers, who nodded acknowledgement before scanning the crowd for competing bids. The California couple looked annoyed, but not surprised. This was how auctions worked. You bid until someone else wanted something more than you did. They withdrew with the gracious defeat of people who would find another exotic pet before the weekend was over. Fair warning at $1,200, the auctioneer called. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 73. The transaction took on a surreal quality as Jed approached the cashier's table, pulling out his worn leather wallet and counting out 12 $100 bills, money he'd earmarked for winter hay and fence repairs. The clerk handed him a receipt, the paper already beginning to wrinkle in his nervous grip, and directed him to the holding area where his purchase awaited pickup. Standing in front of the cage again, Jed felt the full weight of what he'd done settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. 4 wolf cubs, each no bigger than a house cat, stared up at him with those unsettling yellow eyes. They had no way of knowing their lives had just taken a dramatic turn, no understanding that the gray-haired stranger who'd bid on them was as surprised by his own actions as anyone in the crowd. "You got paperwork for these?" asked the lot handler, a young man with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude. Jed nodded, producing the receipt that served as proof of ownership. The legal implications of what he'd done were already beginning to penetrate his initial euphoria. Wolf ownership required federal permits, extensive facilities, and documentation he didn't possess. He was now technically in violation of multiple wildlife protection laws, subject to fines and possible imprisonment. But as he watched the handler carefully transfer the cubs to a larger transport crate, Jed discovered that the practical consequences seemed less important than the immediate reality of 4 frightened wild animals who no longer faced a lifetime of captivity. The largest cub, the male with the white chest markings, met his eyes for a moment, and Jed saw something there that reminded him of Buck on the day he'd rescued the horse from an abusive owner. A flicker of hope beneath the fear. The drive home passed in a blur of doubt and determination. The cubs traveled silently in their crate, too exhausted for further protests, while Jed's mind raced through the logistics of what came next. He couldn't keep them at the house, too visible, too risky. But the property backed up against thousands of acres of national forest. And there were hidden valleys in those hills where a careful man could remain unnoticed. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Jed had the beginnings of a plan. It was illegal, impractical, and probably doomed to failure. But as he carried the crate toward the barn, listening to the soft whimpers of the cubs inside, he felt more alive than he had since Martha's death. The crumpled receipt in his pocket represented more than a financial transaction. It was evidence of the moment when Jed McCaffrey decided to step back into the world, to act on conviction rather than simply endure. Whatever happened next, he was no longer just a lonely old man waiting for his story to end. The old logging road hadn't been used in 15 years. Not since the Forest Service closed it to vehicular traffic after a series of washouts made it impassable for anything but foot traffic. Jed remembered when Martha used to pack picnic lunches and they'd hike the 2 miles to the hidden meadow where Prospect Creek made a horseshoe bend around a stand of ancient ponderosa pines. She'd called it their secret place, though they both knew that deer hunters and fishermen occasionally found their way there. Now, carrying a 40-pound bag of dog food and a canvas satchel filled with hand tools, Jed retraced that familiar path with muscles that protested every step. The cubs had spent their first night in the barn, huddled together in the transport crate, while Jed lay awake in the house, paralyzed by second thoughts. By morning, watching them lap water from a shallow pan with the desperate thirst of creatures who'd been terrified into dehydration, He knew that keeping them penned up wasn't an option. The meadow looked smaller than he remembered, but it still retained the cathedral quiet that had drawn him and Martha there in younger days. Prospect Creek ran clear and cold along the eastern edge, providing fresh water, while the surrounding forest offered natural shelter and the kind of isolation these cubs would need if they were going to survive what came next. Jed set down his burden and surveyed the area with the practical eye of a man who'd spent his life building functional structures from raw materials. The cubs needed immediate shelter, something that would protect them from weather and predators while remaining invisible to casual hikers or hunting parties. A natural depression near the creek, partially screened by fallen logs and overgrown with serviceberry bushes, caught his attention. He worked steadily through the morning, using a folding shovel to enlarge the depression and clear away rocks and debris. The physical labor felt good after months of sedentary routine, his body remembering the rhythm of honest work, even as his joints protested the unaccustomed strain. By noon, he had excavated a space roughly 4 feet square and 2 feet deep. With good drainage and natural windbreaks on 3 sides, the den box took shape slowly. Built from lumber he'd salvaged from an old chicken coop that Martha had used for her small flock of heritage breeds. Jed had never considered himself a craftsman. His carpentry skills were purely functional, focused on repairs and utility rather than aesthetics. But as he measured and cut, fitted joints and drove screws, he found himself taking unusual care with each piece. The structure needed to be more than just a temporary shelter. If his half-formed plan had any chance of success, these cubs would need to feel secure enough to eat, sleep, and begin the process of learning to be wild. That required something that felt like a proper den, dark and protective, with multiple exits and good airflow. Working with hand tools to minimize noise, Jed constructed a rectangular box with interior dimensions that would accommodate 4 growing cubs without feeling cramped. He hinged the roof for easy access during feeding and cleaning, then added a smaller entry tunnel that mimicked the design of natural wolf dens he'd read about in field guides. The whole structure was built to nestle into the depression he'd excavated, with the roof at ground level and the entrance facing away from the creek to prevent flooding. The cubs watched his approach that evening with expressions of resignation rather than fear. 12 hours in the transport crate had taught them that struggling was futile, though the largest male still maintained his protective stance in front of his littermates. Jed spoke to them in the same low, calm tone he'd used with nervous horses throughout his life, explaining what he was doing as he transferred them to a larger wire crate for the journey to their new home. The hike up the old logging road tested every muscle in Jed's aging body. The crate, while not particularly heavy, was awkward to carry over rough terrain, and the cub's movement inside it threw off his balance on several occasions. He had to stop frequently to rest, setting the crate down carefully while he caught his breath and adjusted his grip. By the time they reached the meadow, sunset was painting the tops of the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and rose. Jed positioned the crate near the den entrance and opened the door, stepping back to give the cubs space to explore their new environment. For several minutes nothing happened. Then the largest male poked his head out, sniffing cautiously at the mountain air that carried scents of pine sap and wildflowers, running water and the rich loam of undisturbed forest floor. One by one, the cubs emerged from the crate, their movements tentative but increasingly bold as they realized they weren't confined. The female with the torn ear was the first to approach the creek, lapping at the clear water with obvious relief. The 2 middle cubs, both males with nearly identical grey and black markings, began investigating the den entrance with the focused intensity of creatures whose survival depended on understanding their environment. Jed had brought canned puppy food mixed with warm water, a combination that approximated the pre-digested meat their mother would have provided. He set the bowls near the den entrance and retreated to a fallen log 20 feet away, settling in to watch their first meal in freedom. The cubs approached the food warily, but hunger eventually overcame caution. And soon all four were eating with the desperate efficiency of creatures who had no guarantee when the next meal might appear. As darkness gathered in the forest, Jed felt the satisfaction of a job well begun. The cubs had accepted their new shelter, exploring the den box with growing confidence, before settling together in its protective darkness. The sound of their breathing, almost inaudible above the whisper of wind through pine needles, reminded him of nights when he and Martha had camped in these same mountains, falling asleep to the ancient rhythms of the wilderness. The walk back down the logging road was treacherous in the dark, but Jed had brought a small flashlight and knew the path well enough to avoid the worst obstacles. His knees ached and his back protested every step, but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. He had committed himself to something that mattered, accepted responsibility for 4 lives that depended entirely on his judgment and care. Standing in his own driveway an hour later, looking up at the house where he'd spent so many evenings in solitary routine, Jed realized that his life had acquired a new center of gravity. Tomorrow, he would return to the meadow with fresh food and water, and the day after that, and every day until these cubs were capable of surviving on their own. The den box represented more than just shelter for 4 orphaned wolves. It was evidence of Jed's renewed engagement with purpose, his willingness to take risks for something beyond his own comfort. In the morning, he would begin the delicate process of teaching wild creatures to trust a human being just enough to stay alive, while ensuring they never forgot that the wilderness was their true home. The leather-bound journal had belonged to Martha, a gift from her students during her final year of teaching. She'd used it to record her thoughts about the garden, pressing flowers between its pages and noting which varieties thrived in the mountain soil. After her death, it had sat on the bedroom nightstand untouched, too sacred for Jed to disturb. But the morning after his second visit to the cubs, he found himself reaching for it, drawn to the idea of documenting this unexpected chapter of his life. Day 3, April 28th, he wrote in his careful, slanted handwriting. Cubs accepted the chicken and rice mixture better than the canned food. The alpha male, white chest marking, I'll call him Chief, allows me within 10 feet now before retreating. The female with the torn ear, Scar, is the boldest around food but most skittish around humans. The 2 middle males, Ranger and Scout, similar. Markings, but Ranger has a nick in his left ear, seem to follow. Chiefs lead in everything. The daily hikes to the hidden meadow had become the anchor point around which Jed organized his days. He rose earlier now, driven by a sense of responsibility that had been absent from his life since Martha's illness. The routine was simple but demanding. Prepare the morning feeding, load supplies into his worn backpack, and make the 40-minute climb to the creek bend, where 4 young lives depended on his reliability. By the end of the first week, the cubs had established a routine of their own. They would emerge from the den box at the sound of his approach, no longer cowering, but not yet approaching with anything resembling trust. Chief maintained his role as guardian and decision-maker, positioning himself between Jed and his siblings while the others waited for his assessment of the morning's threat level. Day 8, May 3rd, Jed recorded. Chief allowed me within 6 feet today while the others were eating. I think he's beginning to understand that I mean food and safety, not danger. Scar caught a field mouse yesterday, first evidence of hunting behavior. Need to start introducing more raw meat to their diet. The transition from puppy food to a more natural diet proved challenging. Jed started small, mixing raw chicken with their regular meals, gradually increasing the proportion until they were eating almost entirely fresh meat. He purchased whole chickens and rabbits from a supplier in town, learning to prepare the meals in a way that mimicked what their mother would have provided. The process was messy and sometimes unsettling, but watching the cubs' enthusiastic response confirmed he was moving in the right direction. The cubs grew rapidly, their legs lengthening and their coordination improving daily. What had been clumsy tumbling play evolved into mock hunts and wrestling matches that contained hints of future pack dynamics. Ranger emerged as the most physically powerful, while Scout demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to detect approaching wildlife long before his siblings noticed anything unusual. Day 15, May 10th, Jed wrote. Cubs are showing distinct personalities now. Chief is definitely the leader, smart, cautious, protective. Scar is the most independent, often wandering away from the group to explore. Ranger has the strongest prey drive, fixated on every movement in the grass. Scout seems to be developing into the sentinel, always alert, always listening. The journal entries grew longer as Jed found himself captivated by the subtle changes he observed each day. The cub's vocalizations evolved from desperate whimpering to a complex range of sounds, soft chuffs of contentment, sharp yips of alarm, and the beginning attempts at proper howling that usually ended in comical squeaks. Their play grew more sophisticated, involving strategy and cooperation that spoke to instincts thousands of years old. But it was the gradual development of trust that affected Jed most profoundly. Chief was the first to accept his presence during feeding, no longer retreating to the far side of the den area when Jed appeared with food bowls. The breakthrough came on a rainy morning in mid-May, when Jed found Chief standing guard over his sick sister, who had developed what appeared to be a mild stomach ailment. Instead of fleeing when Jed approached, Chief held his ground, yellow eyes locked on the human who had become a constant in their lives. For several minutes, they regarded each other in silence, rain dripping from the pine boughs overhead. Then Chief stepped aside just a foot, but enough to allow Jed closer access to Scar. Day 22, May 17th, Jed recorded that evening. Chief trusted me enough today to let me examine Scar when she was sick. I think we crossed some kind of threshold. She's better now, probably just ate something that disagreed with her, but the fact that he let me near her when she was vulnerable feels significant. The trust grew incrementally, measured in reduced flight distances and longer periods of shared space. Scar, despite her initial wariness, became the first to actually approach Jed voluntarily, drawn by his habit of bringing special treats hidden in his jacket pockets. She would creep forward on her belly, every muscle ready for instant retreat, until she could snatch the offered morsel from his outstretched hand. Ranger and Scout remained more cautious, content to watch their siblings' interactions with the human from what they considered a safe distance. But even they began to relax in his presence, their play becoming more natural and less inhibited when he was nearby. Day 28, May 23rd, Jed wrote. Major milestone today. Scar let me touch her head while she was eating. Just for a second, but she didn't pull away immediately. Her fur is incredibly soft, much softer than I expected. I could feel her pulse through the thin skin of her ears. It struck me that she's trusting me with her life. They all are. The physical contact, brief as it was, affected Jed more than he'd anticipated. For months, he'd lived without meaningful touch, the casual human contact that most people took for granted. Martha had been an affectionate woman, quick to squeeze his hand or brush lint from his shirt, and her absence had left him starved for connection in ways he'd only begun to understand. The cubs couldn't replace human companionship, but their growing acceptance of his presence filled a void he hadn't realized was consuming him. Watching them play and learn, documenting their development in Martha's journal, he felt useful again in a way that had nothing to do with maintaining property or managing finances. As spring advanced toward summer, the cubs' increasing size and confidence signaled that the easy phase of their relationship was drawing to a close. Soon they would be too large and too capable to need his daily care. The question that kept Jed awake at night, staring at the ceiling where Martha used to sleep beside him, was whether he would have the strength to let them go when the time came. The piece of pine started as kindling for the fireplace, but something about its grain caught Jed's attention on a sleepless night in late June. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table, unable to shake the growing certainty that his time with the cubs was drawing to a close. At 4 months old, they had tripled in size and grown increasingly restless within the confines of their hidden meadow. Their hunting skills had progressed from catching field mice to successfully taking rabbits. and their howling had evolved from puppy squeaks to haunting calls that carried for miles through the mountain night. The carving took shape slowly over several evenings, Jed's arthritic fingers coaxing detail from the soft wood with Martha's old paring knife. He'd never considered himself artistic, but muscle memory from childhood guided his hands as they worked. His father had been a whittler, one of those old-fashioned men who could transform a piece of scrap wood into a recognizable animal during the course of a single conversation. The skill had seemed to skip Jed's generation, but now, faced with the need to create something permanent from this temporary experience, his hands remembered lessons he thought he'd forgotten. The figurine began as a simple sitting wolf, but as Jed worked, details emerged that were unmistakably Chief, the alert ears, the white chest marking, the confident posture of a natural leader. Working on it in the evenings helped him process the decision he knew he had to make, each careful cut of the knife bringing him closer to accepting what his heart resisted. Dr. Sarah Peterson had been Martha's veterinarian, and had remained a friend even after there were no more animals to treat at the McCaffrey place. When Jed called her with carefully worded questions about wolf behavior and development, she answered with the professional discretion of someone who understood that certain conversations required plausible deniability. Hypothetically speaking, she said during a visit to examine Jed's horses, young wolves need to establish territory and learn complex social behaviors that can only happen in a truly wild environment. By 6 months of age, they should be capable of independent survival if they've received proper instruction. She'd emphasized the word proper in a way that suggested she understood the subtext of his questions. The cubs had learned to hunt small game, to recognize dangerous scents, and to move through the forest with the stealth their species required for survival. But they lacked the fear of humans that would keep them alive in a world where wolves were still viewed with suspicion and hostility by many ranchers and hunters. The most important lesson, Dr. Peterson had continued, is that humans represent danger. A wolf that associates people with food or safety is a wolf with a death sentence. Her words echoed in Jed's mind as he made his final preparations. He had gradually reduced the frequency of his visits to the meadow, coming every other day instead of daily, then extending the gaps to 3 days. The cubs had adapted to these changes with increasing independence, relying more on their own hunting skills and less on the food he provided. The morning of the release dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crystalline air that made the surrounding peaks seem close enough to touch. Jed loaded his backpack with what he had decided would be his final offering, fresh salmon he'd purchased at considerable expense from a specialty market in Billings. If this was to be their last shared meal, he wanted it to be memorable. The cubs greeted his arrival with their usual enthusiasm, though he noticed they maintained more distance than they had in earlier weeks. Chief, now nearly 40 pounds and showing the angular features of adolescence, approached to within arm's reach, but didn't attempt to make contact. Scar, always the most independent, kept to the periphery of the group. Her attention divided between Jed and the forest beyond. Jed set out the salmon in 4 separate portions, spacing them farther apart than usual. As the cubs focused on their unexpected feast, he quietly dismantled the den box he'd built 3 months earlier. The structure had served its purpose, but leaving it in place would create an artificial attraction that might draw the wolves back to seek human contact. The cubs watched with mild interest as he loaded the dismantled shelter into his backpack, their attention quickly returning to the rich flavor of fresh fish. They had no way of understanding the significance of his actions, no concept that this represented the end of one phase of their lives and the beginning of another. When the meal was finished, Jed settled on his usual fallen log and spoke to them as he had every day since their arrival in the meadow. He told them about the vast wilderness that stretched beyond their small valley, about the deer and elk they would learn to hunt, about the importance of staying away from humans who might not understand their value. Chief listened with the focused attention he'd always shown, yellow eyes never leaving Jed's face. The other cubs grew restless as the afternoon advanced, beginning to engage in the rough play that had become their primary occupation. But Chief remained alert, as if sensing that something important was happening. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Jed stood and shouldered his pack for the final time. The cubs watched his movements, with the casual interest they'd shown to his departures hundreds of times before. They had no way of knowing this one was different, that the human who had defined their world for 3 months would not return tomorrow or the day after. Jed walked to the edge of the meadow before turning back. Chief had followed him part way, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly curious about the departure routine. For a moment, man and wolf regarded each other across the growing darkness, sharing a connection that transcended species and circumstance. "Be safe," Jed whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening wind. "Remember what I taught you, but forget that I was ever here." The walk down the old logging road felt longer than usual, each step taking him farther from creatures who had given his life meaning and purpose. By the time he reached his truck, full darkness had settled over the mountains, and the first howls of the night were beginning to echo through the valleys. Back in his kitchen, Jed placed the carved wolf figurine on the windowsill where it could catch the morning light. The simple sculpture represented more than artistic achievement. It was proof that something profound had happened in those hidden months, evidence of a connection that would endure long after the cubs had forgotten the taste of food from human hands. The house felt emptier than it had since Martha's death. But this emptiness carried a different quality. Instead of the hollow ache of loss, Jed felt the bittersweet satisfaction of a job completed, a responsibility fulfilled. He had given 4 wild creatures the gift of survival skills and the freedom to use them. Whether they would thrive in the vast wilderness beyond his protection remained to be seen, but he had done everything in his power to prepare them for that challenge. The photograph was an accident, taken during the cubs' 2nd month in the meadow, when Jed had brought his old Polaroid camera to document their development for the journal. He'd set the camera on a rock and used the timer function, intending to capture an image of the den site for his records. What he got instead was a candid moment, himself sitting cross-legged in the grass with 4 grey shapes clustered around him, Chief actually touching his knee while Scar investigated his bootlaces. The image had faded over the 3 years since the release, the colors shifting to sepia tones that made it look like an artifact from another century. Jed kept it tucked behind his driver's license in his worn leather wallet, protected by a small piece of tissue paper Martha had used to wrap a Christmas ornament. He never looked at it deliberately, but sometimes when he reached for money or identification, his fingers would brush against its edges and he would remember the weight of Chief's paw on his leg, the surprising softness of Scar's fur. Those memories sustained him through the long months after the release, when his daily routine reverted to its previous emptiness. The journal entries became sporadic, then stopped entirely as summer gave way to fall, without any sign of the cubs. Jed told himself this was success. Wild wolves should remain invisible to humans, but the rational understanding did nothing to ease the ache of separation. The first winter after the release was the hardest. Every distant howl made him wonder if he was hearing familiar voices calling from the darkness beyond his property. He caught himself loading extra food into his truck on trips to town, old habits suggesting he might need supplies for 4 additional mouths. The carved wolf figurine on the kitchen windowsill became a talisman, something he touched for luck when the loneliness pressed too heavily against his chest. Doc Harrison noticed the changes during Jed's annual physical that October. The blood pressure was higher, the reflexes slower. The general vitality that had improved during the cub's residency now diminished again. "You're withdrawing," the doctor said with his characteristic directness. "Whatever it was that had you more engaged last spring, you might want to consider finding it again." Jed nodded and promised to get out more, but the truth was that nothing else held the same appeal. Church socials felt hollow. Coffee with the old-timers at Miller's feed store seemed pointless, and even the horses required only minimal care to maintain their comfortable routine. At 70, he felt every year of his age in ways that had nothing to do with physical decline. The second year brought subtle changes to his body that he tried to ignore. Climbing the stairs to the bedroom required more effort, and his hands sometimes trembled when he carried coffee or tried to thread a needle. Dr. Peterson, during one of her visits to check on the horses, mentioned casually that she'd heard wolves singing near Prospect Creek the previous month. "Magnificent sound," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "4 distinct voices, very mature. Reminded me of the old days when wolves were common in these mountains." The information sent Jed's heart racing, but he forced himself to respond with appropriate indifference. "Good to hear they're making a comeback," he said. Though privately, he spent the next several weeks listening for howls that never seemed to reach his property. By the third year, Jed had largely accepted that the cubs were gone from his life forever. They were adult wolves now, possibly with territories and families of their own, living the wild lives he'd prepared them for. The photograph in his wallet had become a private reminder of a time when his actions had mattered to something beyond himself. Evidence that even old men could make a difference if they were willing to take risks. His own risk-taking days seemed numbered. The arthritis that had been a minor annoyance now flared into genuine pain during cold weather, making simple tasks like splitting kindling or carrying feed bags exercises in stubborn determination. His vision had deteriorated enough to require reading glasses, and his hearing had developed gaps that made conversations in crowded places difficult to follow. More troubling were the occasional episodes of confusion, moments when he would find himself in a room with no memory of why he'd come there, or discover that he'd been staring at the television for an hour without registering what was on the screen. Dr. Harrison had mentioned something about cognitive screening during his last visit. Words like baseline assessment and monitoring changes that Jed had deflected with jokes about senior moments. The isolation that had once felt like protective solitude now carried hints of genuine danger. If something happened to him, a fall, a medical emergency, a simple accident, it might be days before anyone noticed his absence. The neighbors still checked on him periodically, but their visits had become less frequent as his responses grew more perfunctory. It was during this period of increasing vulnerability that Jed began taking longer walks on his property, partly for exercise, but mostly to break the monotony of endless identical days. The routine had started simply a circuit around the remaining pasture to check fences and water sources. But as the weeks passed, the walks extended farther into the hills behind his land. Following old trails that connected to the logging road he hadn't traveled since the cubs' release, the exercise was good for his joints and his mood, but it also represented a form of unconscious seeking. He never admitted, even to himself, that he was hoping for some sign of the wolves he'd raised. But when November brought the first serious snowfall of the season, Jed found himself studying the fresh white canvas for tracks that might tell him whether his former charges had survived their transition to the wild. The storm that would change everything arrived without much fanfare, just another entry in the series of weather systems that marked the progression of winter in the mountains. The forecast called for 6 to 8 inches, standard fare for early December. Nothing that would normally concern a man who'd weathered 67 Montana winters. But as Jed prepared for his morning walk on the day the snow began to fall, checking the fence line that had been damaged by the previous week's wind, he carried with him the accumulated weight of 3 years' worth of diminished capacity and growing isolation. The photograph in his wallet pressed against his ribs with each step, a reminder of a time when he'd been strong enough to save lives and wise enough to know when to let go. The walking stick had been Martha's idea, crafted from a piece of seasoned oak that Jed had salvaged from a lightning-struck tree near the creek. She'd insisted he needed something to help with balance during his increasingly frequent walks into the hills, and she'd been right, as usual. The stick had become an extension of his arm over the past 2 years, its worn handle polished smooth by daily use, its iron tip finding purchase on rocky trails and icy patches. The The Weather Service had upgraded their forecast twice since morning, from 6 inches to 8, then from 8 to 12, with possible higher accumulations in the mountains. By noon, the snow was falling with the kind of intensity that suggested the meteorologists were being conservative. Jed stood at his kitchen window, watching thick flakes obscure the barn just 50 yards away, and considered postponing his afternoon walk. But the fence section near the creek had been sagging since the windstorm 3 days earlier, and with this much snow coming, he needed to at least prop it up temporarily before the weight brought the whole line down. It was the kind of practical task that had structured his entire adult life. Not urgent enough to demand immediate attention, but important enough to gnaw at his peace of mind until it was resolved. The decision to venture out felt reasonable when he made it. The damaged fence was less than a mile from the house, following a well-marked trail he could navigate blindfolded. He'd done similar repairs in worse weather, and the forecast suggested the heavy snow wouldn't begin until evening. A quick hike up to the fence line, a temporary repair with wire and posts, and he'd be back home well before the storm reached its peak intensity. Jed dressed with the methodical care of a man who understood that proper preparation could mean the difference between discomfort and disaster. Long underwear beneath wool pants, insulated boots with aggressive tread, a waterproof jacket over 2 layers of fleece. He loaded his day pack with fence repair supplies, emergency food, a thermos of hot coffee, and the first aid kit Martha had assembled years earlier and insisted he carry on every excursion. The walking stick felt solid in his gloved hand as he set off across the pasture, its familiar weight providing confidence on ground that was already becoming treacherous. The snow was wet and heavy, the kind that accumulated quickly and adhered to everything it touched. Within minutes, Jed's shoulders were white with accumulation, and his breath formed crystals on the inside of his wool scarf. The trail climbed gradually through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, following the natural contours of the land in a route that had been worn by generations of cattle, deer, and human feet. Jed knew every root and rock along this path, could have followed it in complete darkness by feel alone. But the falling snow created an oddly disorienting effect, muffling familiar sounds and obscuring landmarks he'd relied on for navigation. By the time he reached the damaged fence section, the snow was falling harder than any forecast had predicted. The wind had picked up as well, driving the flakes horizontally and creating the first hints of the whiteout conditions that would define the storm's most dangerous phase. Jed worked quickly, using wire pliers to tighten the sagging strand and propping it with a temporary post driven into the rocky soil. The repair was functional rather than elegant, but it would hold until spring allowed for a proper replacement. As he packed his tools and prepared for the return journey, Jed felt the satisfaction of another small problem solved, another potential crisis averted through timely action. It was the same feeling that had motivated him to rescue 4 wolf cubs 3 years earlier, the deep human need to fix what was broken, to protect what was vulnerable. The return journey began normally enough, despite the deteriorating conditions. Jed followed his own tracks back down the trail, using the walking stick to probe for solid footing on increasingly slippery ground. The snow had deepened to nearly 6 inches in the 2 hours since he'd passed this way, and the wind was beginning to pile it into drifts that obscured the natural markers he'd relied on for navigation. It was the growing darkness that first alerted him to the storm's unexpected severity. What should have been mid-afternoon light had faded to an early dusk, the heavy clouds and blowing snow creating an artificial twilight that made depth perception nearly impossible. Jed pulled out his flashlight and was alarmed to discover that its beam penetrated only a few feet into the swirling white chaos. The trail, which had been clearly visible on his outbound journey, now existed mainly as a slight depression in the accumulating snow. Jed found himself stopping frequently to verify his route, using the walking stick to probe for the hard-packed earth that indicated he was still following the proper path. His progress slowed to a cautious shuffle as the wind increased and the temperature began to drop. That's when he made the mistake that would change everything. A fallen aspen, brought down by the previous week's windstorm, blocked the trail about halfway back to the house. On his morning journey, Jed had simply stepped over the trunk, noting its position as something to remember for the return trip. But now, in near whiteout conditions with accumulating snow obscuring the obstacle, he didn't see it until his foot caught on the hidden wood. The fall happened with shocking suddenness. One moment Jed was shuffling carefully down what he thought was clear trail. The next, he was airborne, his body twisting as he tried to regain balance. The walking stick, which might have saved him, caught between two rocks and snapped with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the muffled landscape. He landed hard on his left side. His leg twisted beneath him at an angle that sent lightning bolts of pain shooting from his ankle to his hip. The impact drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping in the snow that was already beginning to cover his prone form. For several minutes he lay still, conducting a mental inventory of damage and trying to process what had just happened. The ankle was definitely injured, possibly broken based on the intensity of pain that accompanied any attempt to move it. His ribs ached where they'd struck a partially buried rock, and his left wrist throbbed from the impact of trying to break his fall. But it was the broken walking stick, now split into two useless pieces beside him, that drove home the true severity of his situation. Jed struggled to a sitting position, fighting waves of nausea that accompanied the movement. The snow was falling even harder now, accumulating on his jacket and pants with alarming speed. He could feel the cold beginning to penetrate his clothing layers, and he knew that hypothermia would become a factor within hours if he couldn't find shelter or signal for help. His cell phone had no signal this far from town, a fact he'd verified on previous walks. The emergency whistle in his pack might carry in calm conditions, but the wind was now howling through the trees with enough force to muffle any sound. Worst of all, the familiar landscape had become completely alien in the swirling white chaos, every direction looking identical in the premature darkness. Jed forced himself to think systematically about his options. He could try to crawl back toward the house, but without the walking stick for support and with an injured ankle, progress would be measured in yards rather than miles. He could attempt to build an emergency shelter, but the blowing snow would make that nearly impossible, even if he'd had the tools and energy for such a project. As full darkness settled over the mountains and the temperature continued to drop, Jed began to accept that he might not survive the night. The thought brought surprisingly little panic. At 70, he'd lived long enough to understand that death was not the worst fate imaginable. But lying in the accumulating snow, feeling the cold creep deeper into his bones with each passing minute, he found himself thinking about the photograph in his wallet and the 4 wolf cubs who had once depended on his care for survival. Somewhere in the vast wilderness around him, those cubs had grown into adult wolves, living the wild lives he'd prepared them for. As consciousness began to fade at the edges and hypothermia started its insidious work, Jed allowed himself to hope that they had found happiness in their freedom, that his sacrifice had meant something beyond his own temporary satisfaction. The wind carried many sounds through the forest that night, the crack of tree branches under snow loads, the whisper of falling flakes, the distant rumble of shifting weather patterns. But as Jed drifted in and out of awareness, one sound seemed to rise above the others, the haunting call of wolves singing to the storm, their voices carrying across the miles like messages from another world. The first wolf appeared as a shadow at the edge of Jed's failing vision, materializing from the swirling snow like a creature born from the storm itself. Through the haze of cold and pain, Jed's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The animal was massive, easily twice the size of the cubs he remembered, with the lean muscle and confident bearing of a mature predator. But there was something familiar in its movement, a particular way of holding its head that triggered memories buried deep in his consciousness. The wolf approached with careful deliberation, each step calculated to minimize sound and sudden movement. Its yellow eyes never left Jed's face as it drew close enough that he could see the distinctive white markings on its chest, a pattern of irregular patches that formed an almost star-like design. Recognition hit him with the force of physical shock, cutting through the fog of hypothermia like lightning through darkness. Chief, the wolf that had once weighed less than 5 pounds, that had trembled in terror at the livestock auction, now stood before him as a magnificent alpha male, his winter coat thick and silver-tipped, his presence radiating the calm authority of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. The white chest marking had expanded as he'd grown, but the basic pattern remained unmistakable, a genetic signature that connected this powerful predator to the frightened cub Jed had carried into the mountains 3 years earlier. Chief studied the injured, human with an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond mere recognition. His ears swiveled constantly, monitoring the sounds of the storm while maintaining visual focus on Jed's prone form. After several minutes of careful assessment, the wolf lifted his muzzle and released a low, modulated howl that cut through the wind with haunting clarity. The response came from 3 directions at once, harmony building in the darkness as familiar voices joined the call. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs as shapes began to emerge from the storm. First 1, then 2, then 3 additional wolves, each moving with the coordinated precision of a pack that had hunted together for years. Scar appeared from his left, still smaller than Chief but powerfully built. Her torn ear now healed into a distinctive notch that gave her an asymmetrical but striking appearance. She approached more cautiously than the alpha, her body language suggesting wariness despite obvious recognition. The scent traces she was reading told a complex story, the familiar human from her cubhood, but also pain, fear, and the chemical markers of serious injury. Ranger and Scout materialized almost simultaneously from the uphill side of the clearing. Their movements so synchronized they might have been choreographed. Both had grown into impressive specimens, Ranger's dark coat making him nearly invisible against the storm-darkened trees, while Scout's lighter coloring allowed him to blend seamlessly with the falling snow. They maintained a respectful distance while Chief conducted his assessment, but their alertness suggested they were prepared to respond instantly to their leader's signals. For several minutes, the pack surrounded Jed in a loose circle, their behavior suggesting intense discussion conducted through subtle body language and subsonic vocalizations beyond human perception. Jed watched through eyes that kept wanting to close, fighting to stay conscious as his core temperature continued to drop. The pain in his ankle had faded to a distant throb, replaced by the dangerous numbness that signaled advancing hypothermia. Then Chief made a decision that demonstrated intelligence beyond anything Jed could have imagined during their time together in the hidden meadow. The great wolf approached until he was close enough that Jed could feel the warmth radiating from his body, then carefully lay down beside the injured human, positioning himself to block the wind that had been driving snow into Jed's face. The gesture was so unexpected, so clearly deliberate, that Jed's eyes filled with tears that froze almost immediately on his cheeks. The wolf, who had once cowered from human contact, was now offering his own body as shelter, risking his safety to protect the man who had once protected him. Scar moved next, settling against Jed's other side with careful precision that avoided his injured leg. Her warmth penetrated his jacket immediately, and he could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing as she pressed close enough to share body heat. The sensation was dreamlike, being embraced by creatures he'd raised as cubs, now grown into the apex predators they were born to be. Ranger and Scout completed the protective formation, positioning themselves at Jed's head and feet to create a living windbreak that transformed the exposed mountainside into a sheltered pocket of relative warmth. The coordination required for such behavior spoke to pack intelligence that had evolved over millennia, instincts that balanced survival with loyalty in ways that purely rational creatures could never achieve. As the night deepened and the storm reached its full fury, The four wolves maintained their protective positions with unwavering dedication. They took turns adjusting their positions to ensure optimal wind protection, shared the task of monitoring their surroundings for threats, and somehow managed to keep Jed's core temperature stable through the long hours when death seemed imminent. The warmth of their bodies created a microclimate that made survival possible. But it was more than physical protection they provided. Their presence gave Jed a reason to keep fighting, to resist the seductive numbness that hypothermia used to claim its victims. Every time consciousness threatened to slip away entirely, the movement of a wolf against his side or the sound of protective breathing in his ear called him back to awareness. Chief remained the most vigilant throughout the night, his great head lifting periodically to scan the darkness for threats or changes in weather conditions. During one of these surveys, his eyes met Jed's in a moment of communication that transcended species barriers. The wolf's gaze held acknowledgement, determination, and something that looked remarkably like affection, the enduring bond between protector and protected, now reversed in ways that honored the circular nature of loyalty. The storm raged for hours, dumping snow with an intensity that would have buried a solitary human being beyond any hope of rescue. But the wolves' strategic positioning created wind shadows and heat retention that kept the accumulation manageable around their sheltered space. They worked with the instinctive efficiency of creatures whose ancestors had survived countless winters through cooperation and shared warmth. Sometime after midnight, Scout demonstrated the enhanced sensory capabilities that had made him the pack's sentinel. He lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked forward in an alert posture that caught Chief's immediate attention. The two wolves communicated through subtle body language before Scout rose silently and melted into the darkness, leaving his position to patrol the perimeter of their sanctuary. His absence was immediately felt as cold air began to penetrate the space he'd vacated. But Ranger shifted position to compensate, maintaining the protective barrier that was keeping Jed alive. The coordination required for such adjustments spoke to pack intelligence that had been honed by generations of survival in harsh conditions. Instincts that now served to protect the human who had once ensured their own survival. As dawn approached, the storm began to lose its intensity, the wind dropping to fitful gusts that no longer drove snow with horizontal force. The wolves sensed the change immediately, their alertness increasing as visibility slowly improved in the gray pre-dawn light. Chief rose carefully, shaking snow from his coat while maintaining protective proximity to Jed, who was now conscious but clearly hypothermic and dehydrated. The alpha wolf's behavior in these crucial hours demonstrated strategic thinking that would have impressed military tacticians. He coordinated his pack's movements to maintain continuous protection, while beginning to signal for help in ways that only wild creatures could manage. Their howling took on new patterns, not the territorial calls of hunting wolves, but something more complex and urgent that carried across the valley with unmistakable purpose. It was Scar who first detected the distant response to their calls, her head tilting as she picked up sounds beyond human perception. The pack's excitement became palpable as they recognized the approach of other humans, their body language shifting from protective to alert as they prepared for the delicate balance between ensuring Jed's rescue and maintaining their own safety in a world where wolves were not always welcome. As morning light began to filter through the storm clouds, revealing the full extent of the night's snowfall, the four wolves had successfully shepherded their former protector through a crisis that would have been fatal without their intervention. The photograph in Jed's wallet, now frozen stiff against his chest, had become a prophecy fulfilled. The circle of care and protection had come full circle, binding human and wolf in a relationship that transcended the boundaries between wild and domestic, past and present. The emergency whistle had been Martha's insistence, purchased during her final year when she began to worry about Jed's increasing isolation and the risks of his solitary walks. It was a simple device, orange plastic with a piercing tone, designed to carry over long distances, but she'd made him promise to carry it on every excursion into the backcountry. Now, as grey dawn light filtered through the dissipating storm clouds, that promise might be the difference between life and death. Jed's fingers, stiff with cold, despite the warmth the wolves had provided throughout the night, fumbled with the zipper of his jacket pocket. The whistle hung on a lanyard around his neck, but reaching it required movements that sent fresh waves of pain through his injured ribs and ankle. Chief watched his struggles with obvious concern, the great wolf's yellow eyes tracking every movement as if trying to understand the human's intent. When Jed finally managed to extract the whistle, his first attempt to use it produced only a weak, breathy sound that barely carried beyond the immediate circle of wolves. His lips were numb with cold, and his lung capacity had been compromised by the night-long battle against hypothermia. The pathetic sound seemed to disappear entirely in the vast silence that followed the storm's passing, but Chief's reaction was immediate and unexpected. The alpha wolf tilted his head at the unfamiliar sound, ears pricked forward with intense interest. He'd encountered many human artifacts during his years in the wild, but this particular noise triggered something in his memory, perhaps an association with distress calls, or simply recognition that his former protector was attempting some form of communication. Jed tried again, drawing as deep a breath as his damaged ribs would allow and forcing air through the whistle with desperate determination. This time the sound was stronger, a sharp blast that echoed off the surrounding cliffs and carried into the valley below. As the note faded, Chief lifted his muzzle and added his own voice to the call, a long, haunting howl that transformed the mechanical whistle blast into something wild and organic. The effect was electric. Scar immediately joined her alpha's call, her voice harmonizing with his in the complex vocalizations that wolves used for long-distance communication. Ranger and Scout added their voices moments later, creating a chorus that amplified and extended Jed's whistle signal far beyond what the simple device could have achieved alone. Understanding flooded through Jed as he realized what was happening. The wolves weren't simply responding to his distress. They were actively helping him signal for rescue, using their superior vocal capabilities to broadcast his location across miles of wilderness. The combination of mechanical whistle and lupine howls created a unique sound signature that would be impossible to mistake for ordinary wolf behavior. Jed blew the whistle again, timing his blast to coincide with the wolves' vocalizations. The pack responded instantly, their calls building into a crescendo that seemed to shake the snow from the surrounding trees. Chief led the chorus with the deep, resonant howl of a mature alpha, while his packmates provided harmonic support that gave the signal both power and complexity. The pattern continued for several minutes, whistle blast followed by extended howling, then silence while they listened for any response. During the quiet intervals, Scout's exceptional hearing proved invaluable as he monitored distant sounds that might indicate approaching help. His alert posture suggested he was detecting something beyond human perception, though whether it was actual rescue sounds or simply the natural awakening of the forest remained unclear. It was during the fourth cycle of signals that they finally heard an answer, the distant baying of search dogs carried on the still morning air. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the main trail that connected to Jed's property. Chief's ears swiveled toward the sound with immediate recognition, his body language shifting from protective to alert as he processed this new development. The approaching search party represented both salvation and danger for the wolf pack. While their presence meant rescue for Jed, it also meant potential conflict for creatures that existed in legal limbo, protected by federal law but still viewed with suspicion by many rural residents. Chief seemed to understand this delicate balance, maintaining his protective position beside Jed while clearly preparing for the pack's eventual withdrawal. Jed continued working the whistle with renewed energy, the prospect of rescue giving him strength he didn't know he still possessed. Each blast brought an immediate response from the wolves, their calls now carrying a note of urgency that suggested they too understood the approaching resolution of their night-long vigil. The search dogs' baying grew steadily louder, accompanied now by human voices calling Jed's name across the snowy landscape. Sarah Chen had organized the search party after noticing that Jed's lights hadn't come on the previous evening, his usual routine disrupted by his failure to return from the afternoon fence repair. The combination of whistle and wolf song had given the searchers a clear beacon to follow through terrain that would have taken hours to cover systematically. As the rescue team drew closer, Chief made a decision that demonstrated his evolved understanding of human-wolf relationships. He gradually increased the distance between himself and Jed, signaling his packmates to begin their strategic withdrawal while maintaining enough proximity to ensure the injured human would be found and protected until help arrived. The search party crested the ridge above Jed's position just as the sun broke through the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Tom Bradley led the group, his 20 years of volunteer search and rescue experience evident in the way he coordinated the team's approach to what appeared to be an impossible scene. Behind him, Sarah Chen carried medical supplies, while deputies Mike Foster and Janet Williams maintained flanking positions, their hands resting carefully on holstered sidearms. What they saw defied every assumption about predator behavior they'd carried into these mountains. 4 massive wolves surrounded a human figure, their position suggesting protection rather than predation. The largest wolf, a magnificent alpha male with distinctive white chest markings, stood directly between the approaching rescuers and the injured man, his posture alert but not aggressive. "Jesus Christ," whispered Deputy Foster, his voice barely audible above the crunch of snow under their boots. "Are those wolves actually guarding him?" Tom Bradley raised his hand to halt the group's advance, his experienced eye taking in details that painted a picture unlike anything in his decades of wilderness rescue. The snow around Jed's position showed clear evidence of the wolves' night-long vigil, compressed areas where they'd lain, strategic windbreaks they'd created, and the distinctive pack formations used for cooperative thermoregulation. "Nobody moves fast," Tom instructed quietly. "Nobody makes sudden gestures. These animals have been protecting him all night, and we're not going to spook them into changing their minds." Chief's response to the approaching humans demonstrated intelligence that left the rescue team speechless. Rather than flee or attack, the alpha wolf began a calculated withdrawal that maintained protective positioning while gradually increasing distance. His movements were deliberate and communicative, designed to signal peaceful intent while establishing clear boundaries for the human intrusion. Scar was the first to follow her alpha's lead, backing away with fluid grace that kept her eyes on the rescuers while maintaining visual contact with Jed. Her movements triggered similar responses from Ranger and Scout, the pack executing a coordinated retreat that spoke to years of refined communication and shared decision-making. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarah Chen murmured, her medical training warring with amazement at the unprecedented behavior. "They're actually facilitating the rescue." Tom Bradley had participated in dozens of wildlife encounters during his search and rescue career, but this situation transcended every protocol he'd learned. The wolves' behavior suggested not just intelligence, but emotional investment in the human's welfare, a level of interspecies cooperation that challenged fundamental assumptions about wild animal behavior. "Jed," Tom called softly, beginning a careful approach that kept him in full view of the watching wolves. "Can you hear me? We're here to help." Jed's response was weak but coherent, his voice cracked from dehydration and cold, but carrying obvious relief. "Tom, how did you find me in this?" "We followed the singing," Tom replied, closing the distance with movements that were deliberately slow and non-threatening. "You and your friends here put on quite a concert." Chief maintained his position at the edge of the clearing, his yellow eyes tracking every movement as the rescue proceeded. His behavior suggested he was conducting his own assessment of the situation, evaluating the newcomer's intentions and capabilities before fully relinquishing his protective responsibility. Sarah Chen reached Jed first, her medical training taking precedence as she began checking vital signs and assessing injuries. "Hypothermic but stable," she reported. "Possible ankle fracture, maybe some broken ribs. How are you still conscious after a night in this storm?" Jed's eyes found Chief across the clearing, the connection between human and wolf visible to everyone present. "I had help," he said simply. "More help than I deserved." As the rescue team worked to stabilize Jed for transport, the wolves maintained their vigilant perimeter. Their behavior provided a running commentary on the proceedings, relaxing as it became clear the humans meant no harm, but remaining alert to ensure their former charge's safety was properly transferred to capable hands. Deputy Williams, who had initially viewed the wolves as a potential threat requiring armed intervention, found herself documenting behavior that would challenge wildlife management policies throughout the region. "I'm going to have to write this up exactly as it happened," she told Tom quietly. "Nobody's going to believe it, but the evidence is right here in the snow." The evidence was indeed compelling. The compressed snow patterns around Jed's position told a story of deliberate pack behavior designed to preserve human life. The coordination required for such action spoke to intelligence and emotional capacity that exceeded most people's understanding of lupine capabilities. As the rescue stretcher was prepared and Jed secured for the difficult journey back to the trail, Chief made his final decision regarding the pack's involvement. He approached within 10 feet of the group, close enough that everyone could see the magnificent creature he'd become, then lifted his muzzle in a farewell howl that seemed to acknowledge both gratitude and goodbye. The 3 other wolves joined their alpha's call, their voices harmonizing in a song that echoed across the valley with haunting beauty. It was a sound that would stay with every member of the rescue team for the rest of their lives. Proof that the boundary between human and wild was far more permeable than they'd ever imagined. As the stretcher team began their careful descent toward the main trail, the wolves melted back into the forest with the same silent efficiency that had brought them to Jed's aid. But their intervention had been witnessed, documented, and would be testified to by 4 reliable members of the community whose word carried weight in discussions about wildlife, management, and human-animal relationships. The bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance to Miller's feed store bore a simple inscription: Community Wildlife Preservation Fund, established in recognition of the sacred bond between human and wild. Below the words, an artist's rendering of a wolf's profile gazed out at visitors with eyes that seemed to hold both wisdom and warning. The fund had grown from a modest beginning to become the largest wildlife conservation initiative in the county's history, supporting everything from habitat preservation to education programs that taught children about the complex relationships between humans and the creatures that shared their landscape. Jed read the inscription each time he visited town, still amazed that his story had sparked such fundamental changes in community attitudes. 6 months had passed since his rescue from the winter storm. 6 months of physical therapy for his fractured ankle and broken ribs, but more importantly, 6 months of watching his neighbors grapple with a new understanding of the wolves that moved through their shared wilderness. The recovery had been harder than he'd expected. At 70, broken bones healed slowly, and the hypothermia had left him with lingering sensitivity to cold that made winter activities challenging. But Dr. Harrison noted improvements that went beyond mere physical healing: better blood pressure, improved cognitive function, and an overall vitality that suggested renewed purpose in living. That purpose had taken unexpected forms. The rescue story, initially shared reluctantly with family and close friends, had spread through the community with the power of genuine miracle. Tom Bradley's detailed report to the sheriff's department, corroborated by 3 other witnesses, had forced local wildlife management officials to reconsider their assumptions about wolf behavior and intelligence. More importantly, the story had humanized creatures that many residents had viewed as abstract threats to livestock and safety. When Sarah Chen spoke at the monthly town council meeting about wolves that had risked their own safety to protect a human, her words carried the authority of someone who had witnessed the impossible firsthand. Jed found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of community educator, invited to speak at schools and civic organizations about wildlife coexistence and the complex relationships that existed between human and animal populations. His presentations were never formal lectures. Instead, he would settle into a comfortable chair and simply tell his story, letting the facts speak for themselves about intelligence, loyalty, and the unexpected forms that compassion could take. The children were always his best audience, their questions revealing insights that often escaped adult understanding. "Do you think they remember you from when they were babies?" A 3rd grader had asked during his visit to the elementary school. "I think they remember something more important than me," Jed had replied. "They remember kindness, and they chose to pass it forward when someone needed help." The carved wolf figurine had found a new home on the podium where Jed spoke, its simple form serving as a tangible reminder of the connection between past actions and present consequences. Children would often ask to touch it after his presentations, their small fingers tracing the wood grain as if seeking to understand the magic that had transformed 4 frightened cubs into creatures capable of such remarkable loyalty. The community's response had surprised everyone, including the skeptics who initially dismissed the rescue story as exaggeration or misinterpretation. But the physical evidence had been too compelling, the witnesses too credible, and the implications too profound to ignore. Ranchers who had previously shot wolves on sight began calling the Fish and Wildlife Service to report sightings instead of reaching for rifles. Hikers started carrying emergency whistles, having learned that the sound could summon unexpected help in wilderness. Emergencies, the wildlife preserve that emerged from these changed attitudes, encompassed nearly 30,000 acres of previously unprotected habitat, funded through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and the community fund that bore Jed's story as its founding inspiration. The preserve provided a buffer zone between human development and wolf territory, reducing conflicts while ensuring the pack's continued survival. Jed had donated a significant portion of his remaining land to the preserve, keeping only the house and immediate grounds that provided him with the solitude he still treasured. But solitude no longer felt like isolation. Regular visitors came to hear his story firsthand, wildlife biologists studying pack behavior, journalists documenting human-animal relationships, and ordinary people seeking to understand how compassion could bridge the gap between species. The wolves themselves remained largely invisible, as was proper for creatures whose survival depended on avoiding human contact. But their presence was confirmed through trail cameras and track studies that showed the pack had not only survived, but thrived, with evidence suggesting they had successfully raised cubs of their own. The continuation of the bloodline that Jed had saved seemed to complete a circle that began with his impulsive decision at a livestock auction years earlier. On quiet evenings, sitting on his front porch with Martha's wedding ring warm on his finger and the carved wolf catching the last light of day, Jed sometimes heard distant howling that might have been his former charges singing to their own cubs. The sound carried across the valley with the same haunting beauty that had marked their farewell at the rescue site, a reminder that some connections transcend the boundaries between wild and domestic, past and present. The photograph in his wallet had been replaced with a newer image, the bronze plaque at Miller's feed store, representing a community's commitment to honoring the bond between human and wild. But the old picture remained tucked away in Martha's journal, a private reminder of the moment when 4 frightened cubs had taught an aging rancher that it's never too late to make choices that matter. As winter approached again, bringing memories of the storm that had nearly claimed his life, Jed felt the deep satisfaction of a story properly concluded. He had saved 4 lives, and in return they had saved his, not just from death in the snow, but from the slow dissolution of purpose that had been consuming him since Martha's passing. The legacy they'd created together would outlive them all, protecting future generations of both human and wolf in the wild spaces where their paths would inevitably cross again.